All right, let's get right into it. Imagine you spend more than a decade building a multi-million-dollar real estate empire in Los Angeles, of all places, one of the toughest markets on the planet. And then, one day, you decide to just sell it all. Today, we're going to break down why one very successful investor is doing exactly that. And there it is. That's the quote from investor Graham Stephan that got everyone talking. I mean, that's not just selling a property, that's a full-on breakup with a city. It's final. So the big question is, what on earth could push someone to this point? So first, let's unpack this huge decision. We're going to use his story as a window, really, to get a look at the massive pressures facing property owners in Los Angeles right now. But before we get to the breaking point, you have to understand what he's walking away from. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. This was the end of a long, hard-fought, and very successful journey. So here's the rundown of his career. He jumps into the LA real estate game in 2008, when he's just 18 years old. A few years later, he buys his first place, a total fixer-upper nobody wanted. And for the next 10 years, that's his move. Find undesirable properties, fix them up, and build a real portfolio. It's the classic American dream, until 2020 hits. And that's when everything changed for him. And his whole philosophy was actually pretty simple, but really smart. He wasn't just flipping houses. He was buying the places no one else would touch and then sinking serious money into them. We're talking up to $200,000 per renovation. The logic? If you build a beautiful, high-quality home, you'll attract great tenants who want to stay long-term. Less turnover, happy residents, good investment. It was a true win-win. And for a decade, that philosophy worked like a charm. But in 2020, the entire rulebook for being a landlord in LA got a massive rewrite, and his whole calculation of risk and reward got turned completely upside down. Okay, so the first major change he points to is the city's eviction moratorium. This was a policy that basically said landlords couldn't evict tenants, even if they weren't paying rent. Now, he's clear that he was lucky. None of his tenants were affected. But for him, the policy itself was a game changer. It fundamentally shifted the risk of owning property. And we're not talking about a short-term fix here. This went on for 3 whole years. And during that entire time, landlords were still on the hook for everything. The mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, all the repairs. He argues that it placed the entire financial burden squarely on their shoulders. But you know, the moratorium wasn't actually the final straw. For him, the real breaking point came when he tried to do something you'd think the city would be thrilled about: build more housing. And that's where a simple project spiraled into what he calls an absolute bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, the goal here was totally straightforward. He wanted to invest his own money, over $200,000, to build a small 2-bedroom home, an ADU, in a backyard. The whole point was to add a brand new, high-quality rental unit to a city that desperately needs them. Simple enough, right? Well, things went off the rails almost immediately. The final inspection fails over a tiny AC drain line, something he says was a 15-minute fix, but the inspector wouldn't wait. Then a different inspector shows up and adds a bunch of new requirements the first guy never even mentioned. That triggers a surprise sewer inspection, which finds a tiny crack in the city's part of the pipe. To get a permit to fix the city's pipe, he's told he has to give his other tenants a 75-day notice. But wait, it gets better. Before he can do that, he's told he first has to fix the public sidewalk and get a totally separate 60-day permit to trim the roots of a city-owned tree. It was just one roadblock after another. And the cost of this whole mess wasn't just time. That tiny little crack in the city's own sewer line, he was handed a quote for $22,000 to fix it himself. And you can just feel the frustration in his own words here. It's more than just the money. It's that feeling of being completely helpless, stuck in a system where, as he says, every single call you make just goes straight to voicemail. So this one personal, deeply frustrating story about a single backyard unit, well, that becomes his lens for looking at the much, much bigger debate about how LA is dealing with its housing crisis. Which brings him to this fundamental question. If you make it this complicated, this expensive, and this frustrating for private investors to build, then who exactly is going to build the new housing that the city desperately needs? And this is where he lays out the two models, at least as he sees them. On one hand, you've got private development, which he argues is driven by competition to build quality housing as efficiently as possible. And on the other hand, he points to government-funded projects, and he brings up a specific example in Santa Monica, where he says units for the homeless ended up costing over $1 million each. So when you add it all up, the policy changes, the Nightmare ADU project, and his take on the city's larger strategy, he reached his final verdict. The risk of investing in Los Angeles just didn't justify the reward anymore. It was time to get out. So what was the final math for him? It really just boiled down to this. The system, in his view, had piled on too many restrictions, created way too much financial risk, and left very little potential upside. And at the heart of it was this feeling that he was being punished for trying to invest in the community. And in the end, you can tell it wasn't just a business decision on a spreadsheet. It was a personal one. It was about protecting his own time, his focus, and his sanity from a situation that he just couldn't see a way through anymore. This one investor story really leaves us with this huge question, one that cities all over are wrestling with. Regulations are there for a reason, right? To protect people, to ensure quality. But at what point does a well-intentioned rule stop helping and start hurting? When does regulation become a barrier to the very progress a city needs most?